So thank you everyone for joining our webinar today on cultivating digital equity. My name is Sean Robbins and I am the Policy Associate at the Association of Community College Trustees, leading our Strengthening Rural Community Colleges initiative. I'm excited to be leading this work and partnering with the Rural Community College Alliance to provide support to our rural community colleges. Before we get started, I just want to share a glimpse again with where everyone is coming from today. This is based on the registration. So as you see here, we have things split up by our ACCT regions. And it seems like the largest group of institutions that we have coming through is in our central region. We have 23 institutions that are represented here today that have registered. So welcome to everyone. We have a very interesting topic here today on cultivating digital equity. Throughout the webinar, feel free to utilize the chat for any questions that you may have, and also be sure to introduce yourself as well. As a note, we are recording today's webinar, and we'll have the recording available within the next week. So with that, I want to introduce our guest speaker here today. We are joined by Jisoo Song, Digital Equity Advisor from the Office of Education Technology, OET, at the Department of Education. At the Department of Education, Jisoo advises policies and leads initiatives to expand access to high-speed broadband, connected devices, and transformative learning opportunities empowered through technology. He also serves as the principal point of contact on interagency collaborations to advance digital equity, including the American Broadband Initiative. Additionally, Jisoo provides subject matter expert on digital equity to department-led external capacity building efforts. Prior to OET, Jisoo was the senior policy advisor at ISTE, where he led the research, analysis, and communication of federal, state, and local policy issues related to digital learning standards, educator credentialing systems, and professional development funding streams. Jisoo represented ISTE as a board member for the Title IV-A Coalition from 2020 to 2021. He holds a BA in Biology and Education from Dartmouth College and a Master's of Education in Education Policy and Leadership from American University. He was also a 2021 fellow with the Institute for Educational Leadership's Education Policy Fellowship Program. And finally, Jisoo served as a City Year AmeriCorps member in DC, where he taught third grade mathematics and robotics and received the 2018 Wilmer Hale Civic Innovation Award. Without further ado, I will hand things over to Jisoo. Jisoo, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sean, and ACCT for inviting me to speak on this webinar. My name is Jisoo Song, and I serve as a digital equity advisor in the Office of edtech. And as Sean mentioned, my role at OET is to collaborate with agencies across the federal government to help maximize the impact of programs and policies around broadband access and digital equity. And if you haven't heard of our office before, our mission is to establish that national vision for how technology can be used for transforming teaching and learning. And we achieve this in a variety of ways, from guidance and policy development to strategic investments and coalition building. And you may know us from publications like the National EdTech Plan, which we are refreshing during this administration. I'm looking forward to sharing what we've learned through our Digital Equity Education Roundtables, or DEAR initiative over the past year. And I hope our takeaways will be helpful in unlocking access to more transformative opportunities for the learners you serve. And if you're involved in your state's digital equity planning efforts, I hope this can give a good starting point for your discussions. And if you're not, maybe this could spark some ideas for advocacy and grabbing a seat at the table. I think I need permission to share my screen, Sean. Great. All right. Can you all see that? All right. So the big question, leading up to this initiative was, why and how is the Department of Education involved with digital equity? We know that educators, as they're coming out of the pandemic, are increasingly leveraging the breadth of active and innovative learning opportunities that are made possible through technology. our schools and institutions are accelerating the implementation of whole learner approaches with technology as well. And we have an opportunity through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law for such opportunities to become more equitably and sustainable available at scale, including the Digital Equity Act programs from NTIA, which funds the development and implementation of state digital equity plans. So the central question that we've asked ourselves for the DEAR initiative is, these Digital Equity Act programs are run out of the Department of Commerce and NTIA. So what is the Department of Education's role going to be in maximizing the impact of the $65 billion broadband package that's in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, especially as state leaders create plans for expending these dollars? And along those lines, how do we increase access for learners, families, educators, and communities that are the furthest from digital opportunities? And when we think about the topic of access at the Office of EdTech, we think about it from three different perspectives. The first issue is availability. We need that physical infrastructure in place to support access. So you can think of it as those boxes and wires. The next piece is affordability, the family's ability to pay for the total cost of maintaining that access. And we have our great colleagues from the Federal Communications Commission working on that through the Affordable Connectivity Program, which I'll dive into a bit later. And then the third issue, the third piece of the puzzle is adoption. Even when we solve for the availability and affordability barriers, we still need to address the human level barriers that impede access for a lot of our students. So with these issues in mind, our DEAR strategy included three main activities to examine these components in depth, with a distinct focus on adoption. We held a series of national conversations first with communities and organizations that are championing education and digital access, including some families and students themselves. We're currently using the findings from these conversations to develop guidance for leaders as they begin developing their state digital equity plans. We're planning to have a soft launch of that guidance resource on September 20th, so please be on the lookout for that. And then the last thing is we want to spur action and commitment in different sectors in the digital equity ecosystem. We've had strategic conversations with various key players that we know need to get involved in the solutions development, including education nonprofits, state and district leaders, philanthropies, industry leaders, think tanks, and research organizations. So with this overview of our initiative out of the way, I'll briefly share some of the highlights from our national conversations. The full guidance obviously will explore these highlights much more in depth, supplemented with stories of how these barriers and strategies play out in different communities of learners. And I mentioned earlier that we had a distinct focus on the issue of adoption, but we recognize we can't just ignore the availability and affordability barriers. So I actually want to start there. So the availability barriers. We know that many students of color, students from low-income families, students from rural areas lack service from home that is sufficient speed and bandwidth to support learning. And this is compounded by a variety of other issues, such as one, the lack of reliable ownership over a personal device that's capable of supporting learning. Two, digital redlining, which results in areas of low infrastructure investment. And then three, building level barriers that limit installation processes, which is often seen in communities where families might reside in older multi-tenant living situations. So some of the strategies that we found that focus on increasing availability include some of the more temporary measures that we've seen throughout the pandemic, like take-home hotspots and devices, with distribution efforts led by schools, institutions, libraries, and other community-based organizations. But other communities are looking at more sustainable solutions, such as outfitting public spaces as solutions for connectivity, or engaging in partnerships with ISPs to focus their investments on historically underserved areas. Moving to the issue of affordability, some of the barriers that we know of that our community members talk to us about, the high cost of broadband and technology tools for learning compete with basic needs like food, gas, shelter, and electricity. And there's often a lack of sustained funding for locally administered affordable internet programs. So some of the solutions, a big priority for the Biden administration right now is helping qualifying households enroll in the Affordable Connectivity Program, or the ACCT, which, as you all might know, provides a discount of up to $30 a month to pay for folks' internet bills, and up to $75 a month for folks that live on tribal lands. You can find guidance on how to support students and families enroll in the ACP at tech.ed.gov/ACP. We've also seen some ISPs additionally committing to offer ACP eligible households at least one high-speed plan for $30 a month or less with no additional fees and no data caps. So this would mean that if that household applied their ACP benefit to one of those plans, they would have no out-of-pocket cost for internet. And you can find many more details about that at getinternet.gov. So with the availability and affordability barriers out of the way, while the availability and affordability strategies are necessary for closing the digital divide, we know they're not sufficient by themselves. And that's why we focus on this issue of adoption. We also have to address the human level adoption barriers that impede access. And then the guidance being published next week, it might be of interest to this community. We share examples of community college systems facing adoption challenges and engaging in some strategies to navigate them. So I wanted to provide a quick overview of these adoption barriers and strategies here. The first is exclusion of impacted communities from decision-making processes. When the voices of people that are most impacted by the digital divide are left out of our planning efforts, obviously there can be a disconnect between the solutions that are implemented and what communities actually need, no matter how well-intentioned they may be. This ties into the issue of trust. There's often a distrust of systems and programs between the communities that we're trying to serve and the government and private companies. And the communities who experience marginalization often don't trust federal and state governments or services provided by private companies due to ongoing exclusionary practices. Lack of intentional collaboration is another barrier. Without partnerships across sectors, especially between the state broadband sector and the education sector, limited knowledge, limited expertise, and lack of relationships can prevent even well-intentioned efforts from seeing impact. Fourth, the lack of reliable disaggregated data. We know that overly aggregated data results in inaccurate understanding of access to broadband and technology tools for learning. And when we use that inaccurate data to drive funding and program decisions, it can actually widen the digital divide. Fifth, the lack of inclusive strategies for communications. We've seen throughout the pandemic, folks communicating out about the programs and services that are offered to close the digital divide. But when that communication about services and resources aren't in the community's home languages or in accessible formats, public awareness won't increase as much as we'd like it to. Then lastly, lack of access to critical support resources. Our learners, our families might need more assistance to complete applications for affordable broadband programs and other services like digital literacy workshops and to fully understand these program scopes. So moving on to the strategies that we've seen to address adoption, co-creating solutions with communities, collaborating with those who experience the digital divide firsthand is integral, not just to hear about the current pressing barriers, as important as that needs assessment is, but to also build trust and buy-in from the community members as you implement those solutions. Providing multilingual and multimodal technical support. During the pandemic, we've seen communities establish hotlines and recruit digital navigators who, as trusted members of their community, can collect data on common barriers faced by families, support families and caregivers in signing up for programs like the ACP, and provide digital skills training and one-on-one technical support. Building digital literacy along those lines, schools, communities, anchor institutions, community-based organizations have really been key players in providing digital literacy training for learners and their families. And for many communities, it's not enough that we distribute the necessary physical tools and say mission accomplished, right? We want to make sure that they know how to use it to further their learning and other economic opportunities. And then lastly, leveraging trusted community assets. Institutions, including our community colleges, have facilitated information exchange and resource distribution as trusted hubs within communities. And they have also sometimes have the capacity to provide translations in different languages and accessibility accommodations as necessary for learners and families. I know that was actually a lot of information, so just condensed in a short amount of time. So I want to actually do a really quick activity with the audience convened here to help capture what you've learned. I actually did this activity with like a dozen or so state teams that we convened a few weeks ago. And it helped them sort of reflect on the presentation as a whole and then apply it to their own communities. So if you go to this bit.ly link or use the QR code here, you'll go to a Padlet. And I want you to just take 2 minutes just to share anything you're recalling from the short presentation that I gave. Any questions that you have that you would like to further your understanding, and anything else. Feel free to comment on folks' ideas and questions from previous presentations as well. This will be a growing sort of Padlet and available for you to refer to later, even after the webinar. So I'm just going to take 2 silent minutes for you to just add your thoughts to this. And I'm just going to make sure to pull it up on my screen as well so that I can see those reflections. So I'll start the timer now. Again, feel free to add your thoughts about anything you're recalling and how that sort of applies to the communities of families and students that you serve in your institutions. Any questions that come up for you. Maybe it's a question based on what's already been posted on this Padlet. So feel free to take just 2 minutes, just write down those reflections. One more minute. Take 15 more seconds to write down your last bits of reflections. All right. Feel free to continue writing down your last bits of thoughts and reflections, but I'm going to go into sort of my closing thoughts. So the participants who joined our national conversations shared that the solutions that explore through state digital equity plans need to be sustainable and community-driven, continuously involving those experiencing the digital divide. So this means that efforts have to start with a strong plan for meaningful stakeholder engagement, hopefully involving the community college sector as well. And the barriers and strategies that I discussed in the last 10, 15 minutes or so can be a good starting point to ground those stakeholder engagement efforts in. So as your states make decisions on how to invest funds from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law through the development of those state digital equity plans, we want them to include the education sector, you all, in their planning efforts. And by doing so, we can not only leverage this sector's really unique assets to overcome the barriers that I talked about, but also ensure that strategies can actually lead to more equitable learning outcomes for all. So the full guidance resource that explores OET's findings will become available this month at our National Digital Equity Summit, which is happening on the 28th, and become available for download on September 20th on tech.ed.gov/dear. So please keep in touch with OET and let us know how we can be helpful to your community and your states as you all develop your digital equity plans. The QR code that's included on this slide links to the one-pager that describes our DEAR initiative in more detail. So thank you again for letting me have the time to share some of our findings. Again, more details, more stories, and more in-depth look at some of these barriers and strategies will be found in the guidance that we'll be launching in less than a week or so. So I'm happy to share that with you all once it's been published.
Well, thank you, Jisoo. Feel free, folks, if you have any additional questions or any questions in general, feel free to also put them in the chat too. I know I'm gonna pull up the share my screen so y'all can see some of this. If you haven't been able to access the brain dump that Jisoo is talking about here. I think some of these questions are some great starting points here for us too. That there's that folks have. First off, I want to say or want to ask you, Jisoo, in regards to folks being able to contribute to their state digital equity plan. Where can they go to actually make those contributions and really have their input actually put into account as these are getting pretty much drafted over the next couple of months, or I think
Right.
next month it is.
Mhm. So based on what I heard from the state convening that we had a couple of weeks ago, it looks like a lot of states are just getting their feet wet a bit, trying to figure out which are the communities that we need to make sure to hear from. So I have a feeling that over the next coming weeks and months, more of those public input opportunities are going to be popping up within state broadband offices. If you go to, I can actually put the link in the chat after I find it, Broadband USA's website. You'll be able to find, who your state's broadband or digital equity leader is, what agency they serve, and it's just so that you all can, know who is sort of the lead on this, what agency I should be contacting, and things like that. They might be a little bit slow to respond because they're just getting their feet wet, as I said, and just getting their stakeholder engagement processes set up. But the Department of Education feels that they need to hear from the education sector throughout this planning process. So I think the timing is right for you all to begin, talking about the things that you've seen in your communities that work, do not work, need prioritization and investment. So I'll put that link in the chat in just a second. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's a great opportunity for all of our rural community colleges to really try to have an active participation in some of these equity plans that are being put together for your state. So make sure that you take the time to find out where and when those are taking place and going to be coming out for your states. So that way the rural community colleges can be heard and really taken more into account with things. And then, Jisoo, I know you had mentioned a little bit about the affordable connectivity program, which was recently put forth. I know we had did a little bit of a write-up of that when it first came out for folks. So if you want to know a little bit more about that too, I just put a link in the chat as well that you can check out what that really entails to dive through some of that. So I know probably a lot of students that are at your institutions could benefit from some of these opportunities here too. So really it would be great to share that out with your students too, and helping them to overcome the access of broadband. Other questions that folks may have, feel free to utilize the chat here.
I see a question in the chat around defining digital redlining. That's an oversight on my part. I know I needed to get through a lot of bullets in a short amount of time, so didn't define it. But yeah, I think Jerry in the chat copied a good definition of it. Sometimes when our private companies that sort of are the leaders when it comes to broadband access look at an area of investment, and they try to see it from the perspective of how much profit can I sort of get from a particular location, right? And that can lead to some systemic gaps around what area gets built out, what area has the adoption resources, what areas don't. So we've seen ample examples of that happening, not just between communities, but even within the same community, right, along street lines and such. And I know that our colleagues at the FCC are working on some rulemaking to make sure that, while these broadband infrastructure investments are happening, this doesn't become the norm and doesn't perpetuate the digital redlining practices that we have seen in the past. So thank you for providing that definition in the chat.
And it looks like we've got another question that has come up here. Where do we find data supporting retention, graduation, successful completion increases in using digital learning?
That's a really good question. And I think there are some local examples of that, but I'm trying to reflect on, if the federal government has some data that could support the connection between digital learning and some of these outcomes. One thing that does come to mind is, I'm not sure if it's K-12 focused or post-secondary focused, but IES, NCES came up, released their findings from a digital learning survey that they did last year in November. So I can try to find a link to that and put in the chat. And if I can't, Sean, I'll send it to you so that you can share it with your community. But basically it asks, in order to have successful digital learning, what are the gaps that we need to fill? And with, successful digital learning implemented, what are some outcomes that can happen from that? So I'll try to find that link and share it with you all. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jisoo. Appreciate that. And I was looking through some of this brains up, and I think one question that I think seems like it was added recently by our group here is, what are promising strategies that are being used or even being talked about for trying to have more of that affordable connectivity program adoption or enrollment and getting people there? What types of strategies are being encouraged?
Yeah, this is a really good and timely question because I'm actually visiting a community-based organization tomorrow with our deputy secretary that's engaging in these. So something that we've seen as effective, and something that I talked about in our presentation too, is leveraging those trusted community hubs of information, right? Whether that be a community college, whether that be a local organization. In some communities where there's a lot of, immigrant or refugee learners, we've seen those advocacy organizations that stand by them sharing information about, affordable broadband programs, including the ACP. A couple months ago, I had a roundtable with some parent communities, and there was a attendee in that roundtable that recently came from Burma and couldn't speak the language here, right? So they have to turn to their local community organization that was, that was actively translating different, resources into, Burmese for them. And one of the resources that organization was able to, communicate to them was information about the ACP and other offerings that, local companies and organizations were offering. So leveraging those trusted assets. So maybe it starts with a map of the different assets that exist within the community and leveraging them, leveraging their expertise, leveraging like who their main sort of stakeholders are, right? So that's something that I would like to highlight over and over again. And I'm really glad to be seeing a face-to-face example of that later tomorrow down in North Carolina, visiting Charlotte and Durham. So that's something that I would again highlight over and over again. Maybe, in some communities that happens to be a school, right? During the pandemic, a lot of, families have to turn to their schools for more information about X, Y, and Z. And one of the information, pieces of information that schools shared out was around the ACP. So to help out with that, the Office of EdTech developed some resources around the ACP that we have on our website, including a template letter that schools can use to send information to families saying, hey, you qualify for the ACP. These are the steps that you need to take to enroll.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Yeah, I think especially as rural community colleges, as Jisoo just mentioned, the ability to be almost, you're the central hub in your community a lot of the times where folks are going. So really being able to have this opportunity, the ACP, the Affordable Connectivity Program, put out there to your broader community can really help with some of that adoption. So definitely take a look into those resources there. We've got them linked there throughout that article. So that we published earlier this year. So definitely take a look at that. There's some great resources there.
And
Go ahead,
the
Jason.
only thing that I'll add is like, if your community college, if your institution is that trusted hub for your community, maybe that's something that you can tell your states about as they develop their digital equity plans, right? Saying, this is the impact that we're seeing in our communities by XYZ actions that our institution is taking. These are the types of North Star examples that you can look into and prioritize as you develop your digital equity plans to ensure that the strategies and the investments actually benefit the communities you're trying to serve and not widen the digital divide unintentionally. So that might be an advocacy point for this community. Yeah.
Definitely. Feel free, folks. We still have time here. If you have additional questions, definitely put them in to the chat. We'd love to get those addressed for you too. And as people are thinking about questions, I think another one that comes to mind in thinking about some of the intentionality of prioritizing accessibility. What steps or what specific steps maybe are being taken to help ensure that rural communities and also tribal nations are able to have more access? I know there's ACP. Is there anything more intentional that, say, the Office of EdTech is focused in on trying to help support those communities?
Could you repeat the first part of your question? I think you were talking about,
Yeah. So in thinking about the being able to connect rural and tribal nations, connect those communities to more digital access, or whether it's just the sheer access. What are some other suggestions or things outside of the ACP that the Office of EdTech are suggesting for those communities?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that comes up time and time again is when we talk about the issue of adoption, right? Use is one of the things that comes up time again. How do we ensure that after we provided that physical infrastructure, after we've purchased the devices, after we make sure that the homes have adopted the resources that we've invested into, they're actually using it for furthering learning or other priorities that they have, job searches or connected telehealth services and whatnot. So something that comes up time and time again is the issue of digital literacy and digital resilience, right? So we've seen some communities leverage community colleges or their communities libraries to offer those types of workshops to help members of their community develop those skills that are necessary to participate in today's digital economy and society. And the interesting point that I heard from a community college a library that's working on this issue in Cleveland was, of course, there's the content piece to this, right? Where you need to make sure you're filling in the gaps and skills that folks don't have to, participate in a digital world. But there's also a human aspect of it where a lot of folks don't come to these digital literacy workshops because there's like a level of shame and guilt associated with it, with not knowing these types of skills in a 21st century environment. So something that they've really tried and thought hard about is how do we overcome those social stigmas around, not having the necessary digital literacy skills, saying that it's okay not to have those skills. That's the reason why you come to our workshops and gather those skills. So that's something interesting that we've heard through our roundtables around, there are different ways that we need to be approaching the issue of digital literacy from. So that's the digital literacy skills of community members, but there's also the educator piece of it, right? As we come out of the pandemic, as I talked about, more and more teachers are trying to, leverage the online and digital learning practices that they picked up during the pandemic and make sure that, it lasts, in the post-pandemic era. So how do we make sure that we're providing that type of coaching and professional development opportunities for teachers to make sure that those practices aren't being lost as we come out of the pandemic, right? So that's another issue that we're thinking hard about. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think having the access is one thing, right? And being able to get the devices, get the connectivity with those devices for folks is a great initial step, right? It's a first step in getting things set, but the digital literacy is the next step beyond that. You can't just have one without the other. They go hand in hand for the most part.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so, yeah, and so really in trying to encourage that digital literacy piece in the same conjunction of having those devices will allow students hopefully to be able to adopt the technology a little bit better, be able to have the access that they need. So when you're thinking about the state plans or anything and trying to contribute to that, it's not just the letting us get those devices in hand to get to students, which is great, but making sure that you are encouraging folks to take part in any of the digital literacy courses that you might have on campus. And if you may not have specific dedicated courses, maybe it's an opportunity to see what types of other programs that focus around digital literacy that you can encourage folks to take and really try to make sure that folks understand how to connect to the digital society that we have. We've got another question that came up in the chat here. It states, outside of satellite technology that can go out in rain or storms, what are the realistic things that can be done to provide internet access in rural communities? And then there's a second part, and how can we offer incentives for public or private partnerships to increase access to internet or broadband?
To answer that question, I'm going to put a link in the chat to a publication that our office put out in 2021 called Our Wireless Brief. It tells the stories of how 6 rural communities were able to set up wireless networks as one solution to overcome some of the connectivity barriers that they were facing. It tells the stories of who are their partners within those public-private partnerships. What are the barriers that they face? What was the impact of these partnerships, et cetera? So feel free to take a look at those 6 stories and see if any of them resonate with you. I think that will be a good starting point for that question. Yeah.
Thank you, Jisoo. Yeah, I think that's that would definitely be a great starting point there. Any other questions that we have from folks? Feel free to add them there in the chat as well.
Sean, if we have some time, could I ask some discussion questions from this group, and maybe folks can put in the chat their reflections. The first is obviously there's the barriers that I talked about as things that we found in general across different communities that we spoke with, but what are you all seeing within your communities from your community college perspectives as some of the major barriers families, learners, families, and communities face around the adoption of broadband connections or technology tools for learning? What are the barriers that you all are seeing from your communities? I'll put that question in the chat. And I want to focus less on the availability of physical infrastructure, which we know exists in rural communities, but what we feel at the Office of EdTech at the U.S. Department of Ed is, if that becomes the only thing that we think about, we're going to build out that physical infrastructure over the next 10 years, and we're not going to see a substantial increase in subscription rates. So what are you seeing as the major barriers and hurdles within your communities? Faculty knowledge, yep.
I think it's that training piece, right? Being able to have you might have students that are able to get on and have no issues once they're able to have the device, but faculty might not know what's going on. I was just going to say that point more, the fear of technology at times, yeah. Right? And that can go both ways for both students and faculty as well, that things are quickly shifting, as we saw over the pandemic. There was a very quick shift in March 2020, and folks had to get online and really figure out what was going on at that point in time, and a lot of folks weren't trained, and so there was a disconnect, especially for rural communities.
Yeah. And just as, for communities, trusted hubs of information are important to share information about technology and digital learning, I feel like oftentimes it's the same for, faculty and educators. If you have a trusted peer that, is more, tech savvy, right? You're more likely to adopt some of the practices that they're encouraging, right? So one of the case studies that we wrote about a community college in the upcoming guidance publication that I talked about, it talks about, the peer-to-peer support models that one community college is instituting so that, as they're investing in the physical infrastructure, the faculty is also supported in using it to, provide more, flexible learning options for students, give them more support resources via digital means, et cetera. So I think that issue of trust really can't be overlooked, whether we're talking about communities, whether we're talking about learners, whether we're talking about educators and faculty. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And Carol had put in here in the chat, and admitting when individuals don't know what's going on in terms of the digital environment there, or specifically more relying on the old ways of communication, right? As we see with a lot of our students, a lot of our students are from various different backgrounds. And their way of communication might be a little bit different, right? So trying to figure out how we can meet our students where they're at in terms of the communication. Where do they go to get their communication, right? Are they going to social media? Are they focusing more on email, right? What is their mode of communication to really be able to get the information of how they can become more digitally literate or get the access to broadband that they need, right? Trying to make sure that it's not just one way and one silo of communication that you're sending out there. I think can definitely be more beneficial to have multiple channels of communication in regards to any broadband or digital literacy piece or access.
Along those lines, my follow-up discussion question for this group is, what are you learning about, what's working in your communities, right? Especially concerning the issue of adoption. Sean and I talked about a bunch of things that we've seen from our respective, perspectives, but from your perspectives on the ground, what are you learning about what works? Have you come across any promising solutions from communities that you've been interacting with peers that you've spoken to within your own institutions? Yeah. And along those lines, are you involved in those state sort of planning efforts or, current conversations or initiatives at all from your institutional perspectives?
Yeah, Carol just came into the chat saying that she was involved in these conversations when at a local four-year university, but hasn't been a part of this now that she's at a local community colleges. There are grants and efforts and workshops, but community colleges didn't participate even back there at that point in time. So I think, Carol, to that point, and one thing that we really want to ensure that our rural community colleges are doing is really taking advantage of the opportunity to be a part of this conversation, right? Be a little bit more proactive as much as you can. I know it can be very challenging especially when thinking about just the bandwidth of staff, not having the number of staff members currently available compared to a four-year institution. But trying to figure out where are those aspects of being intentional to where you can be proactive, really say, okay, we might not get our voices into it in, 4 years ago or whenever it was, but now let's take a more active role as much as we can. And I think this is, really a great time now, especially as these state digital equity plans are being put together, to really have rural community colleges try to come more to the front and center, so to speak, to let them know what's going on. Because a lot of the times, if the rural community college leaders, if you're not coming forward and letting things known, not many other, when things are getting put into place, they're not hearing you directly, right? That's where I think Department of Ed, the Office of EdTech, too, the State Department of Eds really want to be able to hear directly from the institutions, to see exactly what can be done better, what's going well, what's working, what's not, and what would really be more beneficial for the students that are there on your campus. So having that intentionality.
Yeah, the only thing that I'll add on to that is, the law requires states to, better serve unserved and underserved folks with the federal dollars that have been given through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, right? Well, those folks are the folks that the community colleges, serve, right? So at the very least, one way that your communities can be an asset in this planning effort is you can use our community college systems as a way to, engage with the stakeholders that you're trying to reach and hear directly about those barriers. What are the investment areas that we definitely need to prioritize to better serve you? And from another angle, community colleges can be a really good driver of solutions, right? How can states use this opportunities to build up the capacity of trusted community hubs like our community college systems to deliver some of these adoption supports that we're trying to deliver to the unserved and underserved communities. So there's a variety of ways that, community colleges can position themselves to, help states effectively and sustainably implement their state digital plans in the planning phase as well as the implementation phase. So really all really want to really emphasize that to states as they build out their plans. Yeah.
Yes. Any other questions from folks? Feel free to leverage that in the chat and add any last questions that you might have. All right. Well, with that, I want to say thank you, Jisoo, for joining us today, and providing a lot of these resources and insights there. I know that there was some resources that were shared in the chat, so we'll definitely be able to share those out with folks once the recording is ready too. We should have that set and ready by the end of this week. So all these resources I'm sure that y'all are going to be diving into. Make sure to reach out and be proactive in those state digital equity plans, so rural community colleges can be heard, and make sure that you take a look at the Affordable Connectivity Program, because that is a great resource there for rural community colleges. So thank you again, Jisoo, so much for joining us today. And looking forward, as we do always at the end of a webinar, we will be continuing this conversation and having our next peer learning network discussion on Tuesday, September 27th. I'm putting information here in the chat, so if you want to, please do register for that PLN discussion. If you would like to Check out a little bit more about our Strengthening Rural Community College initiative. We have that link as well. And we are also finalizing some of our webinar details for our October 2022 webinar, which is going to be focusing on SNAP employment and training. So more information coming on that for folks. We've got some great presenters that we're finalizing, and we'll get that to y'all. So I want to say thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I know we have the Rural Community College Alliance conference that is going to be in Iowa this week, starting Wednesday. So I will be there, and I hope to see y'all there as well. That way we connect and really be able to hear a little bit more about your institutions. And so again, I want to say thank you to everybody for joining us here today. Jisoo, thank you so much for all of these great resources and joining us. And thank you for joining our webinar. And until next time, I hope you have a wonderful day and take care.
Thanks, Sean.